A focus coming out of the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, Scotland recently was the need to reduce methane emissions from oil and gas production by 75%. So I'm going to talk to Professor Jonathan Stern, who's the Distinguished Research Fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, about a paper he's recently written about those emissions. Welcome to the interview, Jonathan.
Great to be here, thanks.
Why don't we start with an overview of your study, please?
Okay, so the idea of this study is that in general, any greenhouse gas emissions now have to be accounted for by individual countries, but also even customers really want to know what the footprint of the fuels that they're using is. And CO2, carbon dioxide, we kind of have a fairly good handle on, but we don't have a good handle on methane emissions. And in particular, we don't have a good handle on internationally traded methane emissions from fossil fuels. So the idea of this is to say, particularly for those of us in Europe, where we import a lot of oil, gas, and some coal, what do we know and what can we say about methane emissions associated with imports of particularly oil and gas?
What can you say about them and what can we do about them?
Okay, so what we need to do is to set up measurements for emissions from the wellhead, that is where the oil or the gas is produced, to at least the border of the country where it is being imported. The importing countries have to take responsibility for their own domestic emissions. But essentially, what we need to do is to ask the exporting countries, guys, you and your companies, you need to start measuring these emissions, and you need to do that in a way which is credible and which is verifiable independently. And what the paper does is to set out that this is actually quite complicated. We have six major, I focused on gas and LNG exporters, but one could do a similar job for oil exporters. It would be a bigger job because there are more of them. But I focused on six major gas and LNG exporters that account for more than 90% of our imports into Europe. I've also covered LNG exporters globally. But the issue really is we need to set up transparent and really verifiable methods for measuring those emissions.
Is it fair to say, Jonathan, that it's only in the last, say, 2 to 4 years that we've had more reliable, cost-effective, and extensive means of actually measuring those methane emissions from natural gas production and transportation?
I think that's right. And a big emphasis has come with the launch of satellites, which are able to measure these emissions from high altitudes. Now, satellites are not a complete answer to this because they cannot measure over certain terrain. In other words, they can't measure offshore, they can't measure snow-covered terrain, they can't measure in the tropics. But nevertheless, they are a big step forward because they can measure what we call super emitters. Super emitters are very large emissions of methane. Often the government or the operator doesn't know that they're happening because they could be remote. But gradually, satellites are beginning to get more and more accurate and measure smaller and smaller emissions. So this is a big step forward. I mean, there are other steps forward with ground level emissions, with emissions from drone, where you can measure from drones, from aircraft overflights. This is really becoming a kind of a hot area for new technology, and we can be reasonably clear that, okay, we may not be able to do a perfect job, but we can do a much better job than we've been doing up till now.
So I think it's fair to say that we're at the point now where we can measure most emissions. And is the idea then that the governments will pass regulations? I know as they have in Canada, for instance, around pneumatic tools, for instance, that are driven by natural gas, going to shift them to air, and more inspections and so on for gas processing plants. So we can do that on the regular to get the emissions down. We have that capability, but then how do we certify that the natural gas or the emissions have reached a particular level?
Okay, couple of things before I go to your specific question. In a lot of countries, we can't actually measure those emissions unless the companies are willing to do it themselves. So we can't see any of the Russian upstream because those fields are snow covered for probably 10 months of the year. Offshore, for example, Gata, the Norwegians have done a great job, but they've done it voluntarily themselves. No one compelled them to do it. So we are still, in a lot of countries that are important for natural gas and oil, we are still a way away from being able to measure them unless the governments or the companies themselves are willing to do it. Canada is kind of far ahead of a lot of other countries. So you're not in a sense, you're not a typical example. I mean, there's a lot of excitement about the US, and a lot of the US basins like the Permian still allegedly venting and flaring a great deal of natural gas with a lot of methane emissions associated with it. And the US is a very, very complicated place because there, instead of in a lot of countries where you have individual fields, where you have basins with hundreds or thousands of wells, the whole thing becomes much more complicated. But really, the certification process has to be like regulation. Regulation exists in every country, and what we have to have is well, the European term is verifiers, but I mean, I'm sure there's a North American equivalent. So you have accredited bodies. They could be regulators, they could be private companies, but with technical ability, which actually go about verifying emissions in a way which is accepted internationally of, yeah, this is the way you do it. And you have to reconcile the so-called bottom-up, the field level measurements, with the top-down, whether it's satellites or aircraft or drones. You have to reconcile those two measurements as best you can. So this is not, if you like, going to be a perfect solution, but it's going to be a much better solution, especially in domains where we don't have any solutions at all.
Jonathan, when there is a means to certify natural gas, does that mean then that the demand, this becomes the demand pull as opposed to a regulatory push? I mean, if you're importing natural gas or LNG into your country, you're going to say, look, I want it to meet X percent level of emissions intensity, and that's going to, when the customer says this is what I want, generally the producer then has to go back and figure out how to get it done. Have I got that correct?
Yes, but the idea is it becomes a kind of market-driven process. So if you're importing gas or LNG from a domain where either there is no data or the exporting government or country is not providing you with data that either is verified or that you think is credible, then you would tend not to import from that country or company and import from more verifiable sources. So the idea is to say to the suppliers, listen, guys, we want you to do this. By the way, we think you can do this in a way that benefits you. A lot of these measures are going to make you money, not cost you money, because basically you're going to save gas. But what we are going to do as importers is compare what your standards are with the standards of others. And if we don't think you have standards, or we can't understand what you're telling us, or those data you're giving us, they haven't been independently verified, then we're going to go for supplies which have a much higher level of verification. So that's really the context of what we're trying to do in Europe.
Are we going to see the emergence of a national organization or a group of organizations that come together to create this certification process and then oversee it?
Well, what we have, although it's not well known, is the International Methane Emissions Observatory under the UN. Now, this is a new body. It was only created in 2020. It's not very well known, and it doesn't have a huge number of members yet. And their idea, their raison d'etre is, in fact, to enforce the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, which is a voluntary organization of 74 companies. Mostly, it has to be said, in Europe, but some elsewhere, and that has a framework which says this is the best way to measure methane emissions. Now, unfortunately, it's taking a long time to get that membership up to a global level. And You might say, well, are we ever going to achieve a global level? But the answer to your question is, well, it does exist. It needs to be expanded dramatically. And it may be that even if countries and companies won't join, they will be required to produce similar standards of emissions data and verification. So, you know, we don't have the Russians. We don't incidentally have a lot of American companies either. We don't have Algeria. We don't have Nigeria. We don't have a lot of countries that are very, very important in gas and LNG exporting trade. But we have a start. We have something to build on.
If you could look at over the next 2 to 5, maybe 10 years, how do you see this process unfolding?
Well, a lot of the aims of the UN, of the International Energy Agency, are to reduce methane emissions from fossil fuels by 75% by 2030. I mean, that's pretty ambitious. 2030 is not very long, not really a long time now. But essentially, the demonstration effect has got to be, look, guys, if you do this, you exporters, you're going to make more money. You're going to have more gas to sell. And these are not mostly not very complicated procedures. They're just about stopping leaks. They're about having more efficient flares. They're about stopping routine releases of methane where really nobody cared about it before. Okay, you need slightly better equipment. You need better leak detection equipment, but that is not terribly expensive. And nor is the monitoring equipment. I mean, all of this technology is getting cheaper, getting more sophisticated. So you would hope, and you would have some reason to expect, that over the next 10 years, you should be able to reduce methane emissions, I don't know, by 75%, but a very substantial extent. The key thing, I think, is in countries where they don't have the technical expertise and they don't have the money to do this themselves. And I think that will need to be looked at. The European Union is offering technical assistance and money. I think national governments of importing countries will do that. Maybe their companies will help. There's lots of not very complicated solutions. And I think this is the key. For so much climate change, for so many climate change problems, the solutions are very complicated, quite expensive, and are going to take a long time. This is not the case. This can be done quickly.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.